Hello and welcome back to the third installment of the Completed Life March Symposium series on the topic of suffering. My name is Sarah Kiskadden-Bechtel, the Program Director for the Completed Life Initiative, and it's an honor and a joy to welcome you back to our event today. Joining me today for today's event are Revered Andrea Raynor, Rabbi Mira Rivera, and Sameer Ladha. Today's event is titled God and Death, Examining Suffering from Faith Perspectives. Today, our panelists will be asking the question, what is a good death from the perspective of different theological traditions? Specifically, our panelists will examine how religious and spiritual tradition have well-tried ideas on what comprises a good death and how to amplify the sacredness of dying within an individual's preferred tradition. Our speakers today will examine existential suffering and the physical suffering that results from terminal illness from the lens of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions. Reverend Andrea Raynor, Master of Divinity, has served as chaplain to the morgue at Ground Zero after 9/11 and is the author of The Alphabet of Grief. Rabbi Mira Rivera is a board-certified chaplain and is the associate rabbi and director of pastoral care at Kechilat Romamu in New York City. She also served her residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in oncology and participated in the MJHS health system in palliative care. And she works as an ongoing hospice chaplain as well. Sameer Ladha is a lecturer and deputy academic director of the Masters of Bioethics program in Columbia University and an esteemed bioethicist. I'm delighted to welcome all three of you here today. It's an honor to have you be joining us today. And so a little bit of an overview of today's session. We welcome your questions at any time throughout the event. We'll begin with relatively short presentations from each of our three panelists, and then we'll jump into a discussion and then a Q&A. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Reverend Raynor to begin with her slides.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And I'm just so pleased to be here. Thank you for everyone who is either attending now or who is going to be watching this presentation for just honoring the spiritual dimensions of suffering. It's something very close to my heart. Aside from being a chaplain at Ground Zero, I was a hospice chaplain for 20 years. So obviously something very important to me. And through those years as a hospice chaplain, I worked with people of all different faiths. But specifically today, I've been asked just to kind of lift up the spiritual dimensions for Christianity in terms of how we face death, dying, and suffering. You know, I've told my panelists this when we were meeting ahead of time, and I'm sure it's similar to their faiths as well, that, you know, you get 4 Christians in a room together, you're going to get at least 20 opinions around issues of death, dying, and anything else. Most people know that the kind of 2 main divisions in Christianity is the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, which is subdivided and subdivided. And both of those mainline traditions have a variety of beliefs when it comes to theological ideas and cultural applications of those ideas. So how do we approach thinking about the Christian impact on spirituality, suffering, death, dying? I'm just going to paint some very broad strokes, and then very quickly, I just want to lift up a few cases for thought and discussion. So generally, most people know that most Christians do believe in an afterlife, an ongoingness of the spirit. We, you know, have this kind of 2-tiered system of heaven and hell. And where you go kind of depends on either how one has lived one's life, or it could also depend on the profession of faith. And for others, believe that we kind of go on towards heaven simply by the grace of God. There's nothing that we can do to earn that place in heaven. So again, we have a broad spectrum of ideas about what happens when we die. You know, when I was many years ago, I lived in a little neighborhood, and there was a family with a 7-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. And it was Halloween, and so the boy, you know, lots of scary things around in the yards, and the boy told his little sister, you know, when you die, all your skin's going to fall off, and you are going to walk the earth like a scary skeleton monster. Of course, it horrified the little girl, and she ran into her mom. They were very faithful Catholics, and she said, Mommy, Joey told me that when I die, all my skin's going to fall off, and I'm going to walk the earth like a skeleton. Is that what happens when we die? And her mom said, no, of course not. I'm going to kill your brother, by the way, but no, that's not what happens. And she said, well, what happens when I die? And the mom said, well, honey, we believe that if you're good, you go to heaven. The little girl thought about that for a little bit and said, well, that's okay. But if I'm really, really good, can I just stay home? So I think for a lot of people, the idea of heaven is really not so comforting, because who among us wouldn't want to stay with our loved ones for as long as possible? And also that possibility for Christians of punishment, of kind of eternal damnation, sort of hovers in the air. And there was one priest who I really just adored, who in front of a panel of hospice personnel, we were talking end of life, talking about assisted suicide. And a very religious nurse asked the priest, well, if someone hastens their end, aren't they going to go to hell, Father? And the priest said, you know, I've worked in prisons with pedophiles and murderers and, you know, the worst kind of situations. And I've never yet met someone that God couldn't forgive. So I do not believe in hell. He was my hero. He was not asked back to the hospice team, but that was a very brave priest, because this duality both terrifies people, not all people, and it inspires some to try to live the best life that they can. So there's certainly a tradition of suffering in the Christian church, from the martyrs to the saints to the lifting up of Jesus's suffering on the cross as a way of purification from sin. There has been historic celebration in a way of suffering as a method of spiritual growth. Some just begin to pray when they have been diagnosed. There's a possibility of healing, perhaps. Maybe God will hear their prayers. And prayer can be both a balm to the religious person and a stumbling block if those prayers don't get answered. So again, when someone's been diagnosed, there is this question of meaning, of what does this mean? How do I want to die? Have I lived a good life? We can go to the next picture, Sarah. Some I find just start like a wishful thinking. You know, a wishful thinking, oh, I wish that I would have gone to the doctor sooner. I wish I'd been a better person, then this wouldn't be happening to me. I wish that I had spent more time with my family and less time at work. So the wishful thinking can sometimes be a distraction from the events that are happening. And we can go to the next one, to my very scientific slides here. Again, prayer, people who are not praying people sometimes begin to pray. I had this little quote of Abraham Lincoln up in my hospice office, and I do see it that many times people pray because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. And again, the pain of that, of prayers that feel unanswered, can be part of their existential suffering as they're coping with a terminal diagnosis. You can go to the next one there. You know, some Christians believe, we do believe that we are both body and spirit, that our bodies, when we die, will return to the earth, and that our spirits will ascend. We hope for reunion with God and reunion with our loved ones. So this sense of returning the physical body to the earth, but rising and being reunited with the divine is a very big tenet in Christianity. Go to the next one. I'm always fascinated by people who claim that they have like a near-death experience, and they talk about going through a tunnel, going towards light. I actually took this at an airport because it reminded me of what that journey to the next world would be like. But there are those who have had those experiences, and when they don't die, they have a peace about their dying. Patients have told me, I'm not afraid to die anymore because I know that my life will be ongoing and I will be reunited with people that I love. So I'm going to do just a couple of vignettes so I don't talk too much and let my colleagues talk. But the impact of Christianity, of Christian beliefs on a patient's existential suffering, sometimes their physical suffering, and their ideas around death are profound. And the slides of these patients are not the patients I'm talking about, but they were patients who gave me permission to take their picture. So you want to go to the next one, Sarah. I had a very young woman, this is 20 years ago, just to date me, she and I were both turning 40 within a couple of weeks of each other. She had been a professional dancer. She'd been in some music videos, and she was diagnosed with an incredibly debilitating case of MS. It caused her to go blind and to be completely paralyzed. So she was living her life in a fetal position, unable to see, but fully present mentally. And as I visited her, she began to say to me, she was both of an Asian descent, and so she had some Buddhist beliefs and also was raised in a Protestant church. So those kind of two faiths were colliding for her. And she said, you know, Andy, I cannot go on like this anymore. If I have someone get me something from the Hemlock Society, can you help me die? Can you help me let go? This is no life. And it was wrenching for me because this is, again, 20 years ago. You know, euthanasia is certainly not legal in the state of New York. And I just tried to walk with her and let her know that I was there for her. I felt her pain. But I did take it to our hospice team, and we began to talk about terminal sedation, which is kind of getting her so sedated, rousable, but she wouldn't be able to eat or drink until she could die. And we had a very large discussion around it with ethicists and doctors and spiritual people to talk about helping ease her suffering. And meanwhile, she had a dream that the ancients came to her, her relatives came to her, and she told me, if they come again, I hope I can go. Well, we had this discussion on a Friday. Monday, we were going to begin terminal sedation, and she died in the wee hours of that Monday morning. So somehow she was able to let go with a sense of peace that the ancients were waiting for her. They were in just their traditional garb, and she was going to let go. Go to the next slide. I also had a elderly Catholic patient. She had a cancer that could have been prevented. She'd had a mole on her leg that she let go. Basically, this melanoma engulfed her leg. She was in extreme pain, extreme suffering. She wouldn't accept palliative measures. She wouldn't take morphine. She wouldn't accept help from the social worker or much help from me. But I was there one day, and her priest came, and I pulled him aside, and I said, Father, you know, this woman is suffering. She's in extreme pain, but somehow she feels like she deserves it. I don't know what she's done in her life, but she feels like she deserves this pain. You know, maybe you can help her through that, or what can I do to help her? And the priest looks at me and said, learn from her. And that just went through me. And I thought, I don't want to learn how to feel so guilty that I accept that kind of suffering. It was very hard, and the woman died a very painful, difficult death. For some people, they say, oh, well, you know, God doesn't give you more than you can bear. Everything happens for a reason, which is kind of my least favorite phrase, platitude of all. But many of you have heard of William Sloane Coffin, who was a great minister from Riverside Cathedral. And when his son, Alex, 23 years old, went into the Boston Harbor, and his congregants said to him, well, you know, Pastor, you of all people know that, that this must have been God's will. Sloane Coffin said, we never know enough to say something is God's will. All I know is that when my son went into the Boston Harbor, God's was the first of all of our hearts to break. First of all of our hearts to break. So I'm going to do the next slide just very quickly. Another patient I had was not religious at all. He was Protestant, kind of a lapsed Protestant. And when I arrived, he said, "Are you the chaplain?" I said, "Yes." He said, "We've got to get started. I don't have much time." So somehow he wanted to make up for a lifetime of not feeling connected to the divine. And we had a wonderful time together and helped him find some meaning and connection, and so that he could die a very peaceful and beautiful death. And this man, I just loved him because he chose to be buried in the pet cemetery in Harsdale next to his dogs, because he said, you know, people who bury their pets really know how to love. So I always think of him when I pass the pet cemetery. So in sum here, what constitutes a quote unquote good Christian death? I believe for me, it's helping shift hope from being, you don't want to be a hope dasher or a hope dangler, but somehow helping the patient shift from maybe the hope of getting better to a different kind of hope, hoping for a peaceful death, hoping for reconciliation, perhaps within their families, hoping that they do meet loved ones on the other side, hoping that they leave a spiritual legacy that will be remembered and cherished. Many people need to feel peace around not using hydration at the end of life. A lot of guilt around Christian families. Is that wrong to not put a feeding tube in mom? Is that wrong to not hydrate, even though we know hydration at the end of life causes more suffering? You know, again, the feeling that that our lives have meaning. And the other thing, and I am wrapping up here, is that many Christian families that I have been with kind of talk to their families about leaving signs. They want to watch for the signs that they have kind of made it, that they're okay. And I feel like I actually got a sign years ago. You can go to the next slide, Sarah, that after working as, I think maybe I got this in a different order, but this, I mean, obviously nature is huge. You want to go to the next one? Do I have the airplane? Oh, well, I guess I saw a rainbow actually with a plane passing it one day when I was going downtown on an anniversary of 9/11. And I just felt like what it meant is that God is present with us in all of our days. So our final hope, I think, is to feel the gratitude that we have loved someone so much that saying goodbye is hard, but we've loved them so much that we wish them a peaceful ending of their life. So that is like a blitz through some Christianity and relieving existential suffering. And maybe during the discussion, if anyone has specific questions, I'm happy to answer those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Andrea. And now let's turn to Rabbi Mira Rivera.
Good afternoon, friends. So a discussion on a good death, a discussion on suffering and death, must begin with the recognition that each one is created in the image of the divine. So in Judaism, this inestimable value on human life is a cardinal principle of Jewish life and Jewish law. It includes an obligation. So here's this word, an obligation to maintain one's own health, an obligation for self-preservation. And where do we derive this from? We derive this from a teaching from the book of Leviticus. So Sarah, if you could share my first slide. And this teaching says, "You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor." So this being predicated on the very first teaching that every human being is created in the image of the divine. Sometimes the translation is, in Hebrew we say B'Tselem Elohim, in the shadow of, but we would say in the image of the divine. So there it is in the book of Leviticus. So the English sometimes is sort of problematic and clunky, when we translate, as any of you who have tried to translate anything from one language to the other. But in the Hebrew, it says, do not stand upon, like almost like on the blood. Like literally, if you think of like these movies, like you're standing on the blood of your fellow, right? Neighbor, not just even neighbor who is in your periphery, but someone who is your friend, someone who is your companion, someone with whom you walk with. So if we say this came from, from biblical times, now fast forward to what we say our progressive Middle Ages. Maimonides, who was a rabbi, a biblical scholar, and a physician, as many of the rabbis were then, taught in Mishnah Torah an expansion on this teaching. Anyone who is able to save a life but fails to do so violates this teaching. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. So having that as our grounding, we move on to the next slide, slide 2. Sarah, if you could bring up, yes. So these two words in the Jewish lexicon, pikuach nefesh. So we say it's the duty to save the life of one's fellow human being, whether they or should they be in mortal danger. And the nefesh also is not only the human body, it's their breath, right? Saving breath of humanity. And for a moment, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so here's a scenario. Here's a scene. So we draw a lot from the text. And here's a scene where you have Moses leading the Israelites, leading a people who had been serving, who had been in servitude, who had been in suffering, who were suffering as a bound people, right? Bound to serve. And Moses says to his people, it turns back to them, and they are in transit, and he says, have no fear. Stand by, collect yourselves, and see the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For they whom you see as Mitzrayim, we say Mitzrayim is, it's loosely translated as Egypt or Egyptians, such a bad rap on Egyptians, but rather we say those who are coming from, those who perpetrate the narrowisms in your life, right? See that you will never see them again. So this is the promise Moses is giving to the people. And he continues, the Lord will battle for you and you will hold your peace. So imagine the suffering people are being told this. And then the voice comes. And God says to Moses, in Hebrew, he says, Ma titzak alai, like, what's up? Why do you cry out to me? Why are you implicating me? God is saying, tell the Israelites to lift yourselves up and move forward, right? Get up, keep going. So I bring this to you because the suffering here is inherent and it doesn't seem so apparent. It presumes that the people who asked to be liberated from the oppression that they had lived for generations had been suffering. We see here a Moses who was a leader giving his call to action, but he himself too has like a prayer that is stuck in his throat. And when they say that this verse 15 that is translated as, why do you cry out to me? We see in the Hebrew, it's like, why are you like, I'm holding my throat here, right? Why is this cry coming out of your throat, right? From the depths of your throat, this desperation. In fact, God says to Moses, move it. lift yourselves up, and keep going forward. So where's the suffering? So let us just melt away this screen, these words for a moment so we can see each other. 5 things I'm extrapolating from this. Number 1, do not fear. Number 2, collect yourselves. Stand yourself on up, right? I'm thinking of a song by James Taylor, dating myself here, right? Stand it on up. Now see clearly what resources you have. For a moment, be still and listen. And now move forward and lift yourselves up. Brave words and words that we've extrapolated from the biblical text. Well, now let's just melt these words away and just look at each other. And now as human beings, what do we have? What we have is each other. And what's unspoken here is the suffering. So between the time of the biblical text, so I'm going to situate this a little bit in historical or like scholarly concept, and in between this teaching, this progressive teaching from the Middle Ages, right, giving responsibility to human beings, is the unspoken suffering of love, right? In Hebrew, we say Yisurin Ahava. Is this because it was given to us by God? Is the suffering because it was given to us by God? Is it a suffering out of estrangement from the Holy One, blessed be? Is it a suffering based on estrangement from your land of origin? All of this is what is the unspoken. And for a Jewish person moving into life today, oftentimes, what is a good death? What would that look like? It would look like it would be one who is surrounded, for example, a person having a good death experience would be surrounded by family, by community. So I want to share, for example, my prayer shawl here. Oftentimes I've seen in the hospitals, when I've visited Jewish patients, they might be surrounded, they might have near them a prayer shawl, right? And some of them, would be wearing it, or they would be, evidence, even if they're not allowed to light candles, evidence of a Shabbat practice, a Sabbath practice. Or during this time, when we are approaching Passover, which is to begin tonight, there might be evidence of matzah, right? Matzah, even if they can't eat, right? If they cannot imbibe matzah at this time, but there's evidence of that. So this reminders of prayer, reminders of community, start to create a kind of a fence, a kind of protection, a kind of affirmation for a Jew that they are having a life. They had a life, and they're now in gradual transition through illness, but they're still surrounded by community and evidence of their tradition. But at the end of the day, the suffering that we had muted, right? The suffering of love, the suffering of estrangement, the gradual loss of one's facilities can only be mitigated by the human touch, by human presence. For this reason, you will often see Jewish patients surrounded by family. And if there is no family, and this happens, if there is no physical family, it will be the Jewish community. It would also be, thank goodness, in our hospitals these days and in our adult rehabs, the presence of Jewish chaplains who my own teachers learned from Christian cohorts. They put themselves through interfaith learning in our hospitals. And now, thank goodness, we have also developed so we could our own Jewish chaplaincy resources so that our seminarians and our social workers and our clergy can avail of themselves of this wealth, which is chaplaincy and palliative care. So I rest on this, and I pass on this wonderful conversation to my colleagues.
Thank you, Rabbi Mira. And now over to Sameer Ladha.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. I'm actually honored to be in the esteemed company of the Reverend and the Rabbi, and I wanted to also extend my gratefulness to the Completed Life Initiative for hosting this event on a very important topic. And it's interesting, as I was listening to the Reverend and Rabbi Mira as well, there was so much overlap, I think, between the faiths, the three distinct faiths that we're kind of representing. And I think partly it's because they all emerge from the Abrahamic tradition. And so there are very similar perspectives and also some distinct differences as well. But the overlap is quite incredible as well. So I thought I would begin by just kind of giving a little bit of a background about medical ethics and religion in Islam and how it kind of emerged. And the reason I thought that might be a good way to frame the discussion is to highlight kind of the holistic approach to healthcare that the religion kind of endorses. So Sarah, if we can start with the first slide or the next slide. Thank you. So the Islamic medical ethics finds root in the Galeno-Islamic tradition, which is founded on Greek medical knowledge, and it's a shared history with the Western medical knowledge as well. We often hear of names like Avicenna and others who are considered fathers of modern medicine, and Avicenna was a Muslim, Ibn Sina was his name, and so there is kind of a root commonality in how we approach health and healthcare in both the Western traditions and also the Islamic tradition. The Galeno Islamic tradition focused on this idea of a union of philosophy and medicine, and practitioners were known as hakims, which was kind of a combination of a doctor and a wise man. So it wasn't just that you had to be proficient in kind of the medical knowledge, but that there was some wisdom behind that, and the approach to medical care was one that was something to be taken very seriously. And practitioners in the field were trained in logic, analysis and judgment, ethics, morally sound action, and physics. And this is really interesting because the reason they had to be trained in this area was to kind of know our place in the cosmos, so to speak, so that we realize that we are not at the ends of knowledge, and that we need to guard against this idea of thinking that we know it all, and guard against hubris. And also related to that is this notion of we're mortals, and that we will ultimately pass on. But the overarching theme was that there was a holistic approach to health, and that effective medical treatment tended to not only the physical body, but also the soul and the mind. And collectively, that encapsulated well-being. Sarah, if we could go to the next slide, please. And so a modern interpretation of this might be that aspects of care are comprised of all of these various features: the physical, the psychological, psychiatric, social, spiritual, cultural, ethical, legal, and perhaps others as well. But that care does not just tend to our physical self, but actually there's a host of issues that we need to tend to, and they all relate to our overall health and well-being. The next slide, please. So in Islam, there's, when we talk about kind of end of life issues, or when we talk about any issues, sometimes we may be using a term, and I may be using that term in one way. Sarah or anyone else, Andrea, you might be using it in a different way, but we're using the same term and we're thinking that we're talking about the same thing. And that causes a lot of confusion, I think. So, for example, I think a good example of this is death. When we say, oh, when I die or when somebody dies, we automatically think that we're talking about that same moment. But in reality, it could be very different depending on which perspective we're coming from. So, for example, traditionally in Islam, death occurs with the cessation of respiration and circulation. And for example, under this definition, a thing like organ transplantation is not viable because at that point, those organs are no longer healthy to be transplanted. But the US legal definition of death is whole brain death. And so there's a difference in how death is even defined here. But that makes something, for example, like organ transplantation viable under the US standard, but under the traditional Islamic standard, it's no longer viable. The reason I highlight this is it highlights kind of the evolving nature of the discussion, but also the death and other terms that we use, especially at sensitive moments around the dying process, can be defined differently by different individuals, although we may think that we're saying the same thing. So it's always important to kind of identify, are we talking about the same thing when we're using the same term? If we could go to the next slide. And related to that, there's also an evolution that happens, I think, in religious discourse. And I often compare, I'm a lawyer by training, so I often compare Islamic jurisprudence akin to kind of our US legal system, where in Islamic jurisprudence, if there's a question that's presented to a jurist, let's say it's an end of life question, they will answer the question in a very, very narrowly tailored way. They will answer only the question that's presented before them. And we do that in our legal system as well, where justices on the Supreme Court or judges, they will focus on the question that's been presented and not answer anything outside of the scope of that. And what we then see emerge is kind of this common law precedent where decisions, judgments that are brought down that are considered law build this body of law that we have. And it's kind of an iterative process and it builds over time. But because of the narrowly tailored nature of it, they're legally sound, but sometimes they can be confusing. And they can even sound seemingly contradictory because it often depends on how the question is presented before the jurist. But one of the ways this is alleviated in Islamic jurisprudence is that there are multiple jurists that are deemed to have enough knowledge. And so that reveals or that results in a plurality of opinions that then emerge as being viable approaches to certain moments in our life and beyond. We could go to the next slide. And what effectively happens is that this jurisprudential framework allows for legislation of the most contemporary issues. So today, if we have very cutting edge issues that come up, and the religion may not have spoken or could not have spoken to them 1400 years ago, there's a system in place to help answer those in light of the science that's emerged, in light of the religious knowledge that's been gathered, and in light of an approach that adopts kind of a spirit of the laws rather than a letter of the laws approach. So it's not that, oh, this was not permissible or not around during the time of the Prophet Muhammad who brought down the religion of Islam. And so, no, we cannot do this. It's not so much that approach. It's more like, well, had this been an issue at that time, how would it have been approached? And those approaches are very different. One, applies kind of a spirit approach and not as rigid as applying kind of a letter of the law approach. But issues such as, IVF, genetic enhancement, surrogacy, designer babies, healthcare justice, aid in dying, these are robustly kind of discussed And we're seeing an evolution in all of these areas based on what we're learning. And so the evolution is marked by reasonable attempts to reach sound decisions for our time as well. Because for a religion to remain durable, for it to remain applicable, for it to remain relevant, it needs to respond to the issues of the time, for that time and within that time frame, and within the understanding of the people of that time as well. And so as far as how these determinations are made, they try and take all of these things into account. And go to the next slide, please. And then I wanted to kind of highlight this note of individuality, that I think organized religions, like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they're tasked with legislating for the majority rules that really govern a bilateral relationship. And that just, that seems difficult, because that relationship is ultimately between an individual and their God. But we have these structures in place where we organize religion, which sets out rules for that relationship, which is a very personal relationship. And so from an Islamic perspective, for that relationship or for that religion to endure in that way, there has to be space within that legislation for individual expression and action between that individual and their understanding of their God. For that religion to remain durable, like I said. And perhaps some of the things we've discussed highlight that. If we go to the next slide, please, Sarah. Actually, before we do that, one thing I wanted to mention, there are certain instances where we see this kind of tension that exists. I would give an example of, for example, if there's a sick child of a Muslim parent, and they're required to take medicine that contains alcohol or pork products, which are forbidden in the religion. How does that parent and that family negotiate what needs to be done, right? How severe is the illness? Is there an alternative to this particular medication that is permissible? The ingredients are permissible. What about autonomy? What about the child's perspective and their decision making? All of these things are approached from a medical ethics, a medical perspective, but as well as a religious perspective. There are answers, there are approaches to all of those. So for instance, if it's a medication that is going to save the child, then that medication should be given, even if it contains products that are impermissible. If there are alternate products that can be used, that are equally effective, then those should be used instead. So there's a logical, a religious kind of deduction that then takes place. But this gets more complicated and more nuanced as well in more delicate moments, like when we talk about the double effect of pain medication, for example. This idea that life and death are in the religion viewed to be in God's hands. And the physician or medical practitioner is there to alleviate suffering, right? But what if that line is blurred, where that life and death moment, or that moment of death, or getting to that moment of death, requires enduring so much suffering? So if the physician is expected to alleviate suffering, then can they administer something to help alleviate that suffering? So it becomes very blurred, and this is that space that I was talking about that becomes very personal. And people use their religious understandings, their religious perspectives. There are clear answers to some of these, where something may be permissible, something may be forbidden to do. But there are certain moments where it's unclear. And how do you navigate that? And that brings in that very personal relationship that an individual has with their God. And so this reminds me of an instance of a story that I had heard many years ago that my parents were talking about. We were at our dinner table, and they were talking about one of my dad's aunts who passed away many years before that even. And my dad said they gave her a slow poison, which was a term that they had used. This was an aunt of my father's in India. And I was like, what is slow poison, right? And so, my dad said, oh, she was not feeling well and she was really suffering a lot. So the doctors gave her this medication to help put her at ease and so that she could pass away. comfortably. And the term that was commonly used in India at the time was slow poison. Um, but uh, that kind of sparked this question in my mind. Well, is that allowed? Is that not allowed? Is that, and I was a kid and it was kind of a conversation in passing. But I remember having this conversation. So, and that idea, speaks to this space in the middle, that this idea of life and death being in the hands of God, but what about when there's intense suffering? And how do we handle those kind of things? And those are much more difficult moments, and much more difficult questions, that I think a lot of our religious traditions are grappling with. And this, again, is an area of intense debate, in Muslim circles. But ultimately, a lot of actions in Islam are based on intent, that the intent oftentimes is more important, than the act itself. We've been told many times that, if I have an intention to do good, that God will give me reward for that, just that intention, whether or not I go through with the intention to do the good act. If I have an intention that, I'm going to give something, to a good cause today, or something like that, just that thought, if it's a sincere one, I'm rewarded for that. Now, it's not the same for any sin that I might be intending to commit. So if I'm thinking of lying to somebody, or if I'm thinking of committing some type of a sin, that intent doesn't, I don't get a sin for just thinking that. We believe that God is gracious and merciful and beneficent, and so for all the good intentions that we have, he will reward us. But for any bad thoughts, or any intended sin we expect to commit or do, or something that we're going against his teachings or anything like that, we don't get a sin for that, for the intent of that. But anyways, that's beside the point. My point is rather that intention makes a big difference, in the religion of Islam. And while the ultimate ends often might be the same, how we approach a situation, the intention behind it, really dictates whether something could be permissible or not, right? So if we're talking about alleviating suffering, and in that instance, the intent is about alleviating suffering, then that intention, is of critical importance. Um, and we make similar determinations, I think, in the hospital every day. I know we have people in the audience as well who work in hospitals, who contend with these very difficult questions and moments from a medical perspective, from an ethics perspective, from a legal perspective. And unfortunately, these are gray areas. And I think just as we as human beings are contending and wrestling with them, so are religions, and they're trying to find out what makes the most sense from the religious perspectives as well. So I would say, as far as perspectives on illness and suffering, we see that illness, religions often, and even in Islam we see this, that illness is sometimes seen as a test from God, and perhaps a means of forgiveness of sins even. And I agree with what Andrea said earlier, that some of these platitudes I also am a bit weary of. But there are certain verses in the Quran that also highlight this. The Quran is the holy book for Muslims. So, for example, the verse that every human being is bound to taste death, and we test you, we meaning God, uh, all through the bad and the good things in life by way of trial, and unto us you all must return. That this idea of suffering, that human beings, we all suffer during our life. And that is part of this trial or this test, that we all go through. And ultimately, we all return to God. Um, and then another verse, that we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give to good tidings to the patient. And again, this idea of patience through suffering, whether it's at any moment in our life, that we will be tested throughout our life, and this idea of finding patience, and those that are patient will be rewarded. Allah does not burden a soul beyond that which it can bear. I know, Andrea, you mentioned this as something that is often referenced. And I think sometimes when we refer to things very frequently, we lose the currency, we lose the value of it. But again, this idea that when we go through this suffering, that this idea that although it is difficult, it can also be a moment for us to try and think that, okay, I can get through this. And then in the Bible, we see quotes and verses such as in Corinthians, where it says, there hath no temptation taken you but such as man can bear. God is faithful. Who will not suffer you, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able to. Importantly, this does not mean that, you know, we just go through suffering, and that by me going through a suffering or a difficulty, that I'm just supposed to endure this as a test. If there are therapies, if there is treatment, we are, as Muslims, we are supposed to take those if it's going to alleviate that pain and suffering and help us get better. And there are different examples in the Quran, Job, Moses, from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them all. But this idea of trusting in God does not mean that we refuse treatment. In fact, treatment is often turning to God, because there is a way for us to emerge from that illness, if that's the case. If we could go to the next slide, please. And in light of that, you know, this idea of hospitals and how hospitals have been approached, and our treatment facilities have been approached from an Islamic tradition. So historically, when hospital structures emerged in the Islamic world, they were called bimaristans. And they've also, some people attribute them to give rise to the modern healthcare system. And the general philosophy was that the hospital shall keep all patients, men and women, until they are completely recovered. All costs are to be borne by the hospital, whether the people come from afar or near, whether they are residents or foreigners, strong or weak, low or high, rich or poor, employed or unemployed, blind or signed, physically or mentally ill, learned or illiterate. There are no conditions or considerations of payment. None is objected to or even indirectly hinted at for non-payment. The entire service is through the magnificence of Allah, the Generous One. So this is kind of the Islamic perspective on healthcare and healthcare access. And just this kind of passage here highlights some very, very contentious issues that we're dealing with in our modern healthcare systems today, right? This idea of healthcare as a good or a right. Should we be paying for our healthcare, or should we be receiving it free of charge? What about illegal immigrants, people who are foreigners, who are refugees? What about their healthcare status? All of these things are issues and questions we have. And this is just kind of a light into how Islam approaches it from this kind of holistic approach. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. And then patient care in the hospitals. You know, again, from this, the study of the modern, the early hospitals in the Islamic world, they were expected to have these qualities, or these attributes as well. That they were supposed to maintain a high degree of cleanliness, high quality of food, if needed, provide new clothes and grant of money upon discharge to patients, so that a person who's in the hospital is not losing that income, and they're able to then leave at least with something so they can get back on their feet on a case-by-case basis. And hospitals were not only seen as a medical invention, but also a social one. And this idea of the Bimaristan, which is what I referenced earlier, these early hospital systems, they were a center of medical care, home for those recovering from illness or accidents, place of catering to the physical and mental health of the patient. Not just the physical, not just focusing on we need to get you better physically, but also the mental health. And so what if the physical suffering is having such a huge impact on the mental health? What do we do then? We have to tend to both. And also retirement home providing basic needs for the aged who do not have family to care for. And arguably, again, I mentioned that this gives rise to the modern healthcare system. Sarah, if we could go on to the next slide, please. And what about afterwards? This idea of end of life as a transition. See, from an Islamic perspective, death is not the end of our existence. It's part of the continuum. That there is kind of this pre-birth phase, then there's birth, then there's life, then there's death, then there's a hereafter. And so the two moments of transition in that continuum are birth and death, right? Birth brings us to life in this world, and death takes us from life out of this world into the next. And there are some supplications and prayers and things that we have that kind of talk about the human condition. And one of the kind of sentences from one of these supplications says that you gave me a place in the loins of my forefathers, right? Highlighting that this is something that my existence, I didn't just come into existence when I was born into this world, that my existence had been preordained, that I have been kind of traveling to get to this point of birth, and that I will continue traveling beyond my death. And that I was moving from a loin to a womb throughout the passage of the past days and the ancient ages, right? That from a loin to a womb, I made this transition. And so that birth and death are mere moments of transition in that continuum. And again, when we approach it that way, suddenly death becomes less scary. And Andrea, you talked about the tunnel that some people talk about have had near-death experiences. That death isn't something that we should be afraid of, that it's something that is part of this continuum. Now, obviously, it is frightening, and it is, because we've never experienced it, we don't know what to expect, and we don't know what's on the other side. But this idea that it's a continuum, and it's just a moment in that continuum of our existence. And approaching it from that perspective perhaps helps us, one, wrap our head around it in a different way. And also perhaps helps us understand it and not be as afraid of our mortality either. Because we have been born and brought into existence to eventually die as well. And that is part and parcel of being mortal. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so end of life in this world is seen as a transition. There's this famous notion of the span of this life being between two sajdas. Now, sajdas are, when Muslims pray, we have prayers every day. You might have seen pictures, or you might have seen how Muslims pray, but you'll see that we go into prostration. And you go into prostration, and then you come back up, and within a few seconds you go back down, and then Muslims stand up as part of the prayer. So the sajda is that moment of prostration when you go completely down onto the ground. And there's this idea that the span of this life is just between those two sajdas, between those two prostrations, and that's a very brief moment. So if we take it in account of the prayer itself, that moment between those prostrations is very short-lived. But there's a whole prayer that actually marks kind of the larger existence. And so it's just this idea that our life in this world is kind of a very small moment of our larger existence beyond this world. And then there's this notion of dying before you die. There are different traditions that highlight the die before you die, meaning don't be so attached to kind of the material or the worldly, or seek something greater than that. That when we actually come to that moment of our ultimate passing from this world, that we do so without feeling that we're at a loss, or that we're missing out, or we've kind of come to terms with that. And then there's this, when anyone passes away, we recite this verse, which is Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, which means that indeed to God we belong and to God we shall return. And again, that's a reminder that when a friend of mine or a loved one of mine passes away and I recite this, it's not only as a courtesy or a blessing towards them, but it's a reminder to me, right, that ultimately I am also going to pass. And that we are from God, and that is who, and that we are ultimately going to return to God. And the final point would be that death is kind of perhaps seen as, change in form, that our body is on loan to us in this world. It's almost as a bailment, something that we have for safeguarding. But we have this eternal soul that has been with us, or that we have been, part of from before we were born, throughout our lives, and beyond this world as well. And I would just kind of finally just end by saying, if we could go to the next slide, please. That, again, I alluded to this at the beginning of my conversation, that what Reverend Andrea mentioned and Rabbi Mira, I found so much overlap in what they were saying. And I think the underlying moral values perhaps are shared by all of us. And as human beings, I think we agree largely on what should and should not be. But perhaps the difference is that our way of getting there differentiates us in the way we kind of analyze facts or information and approaches and historical traditions and where we're coming from and what region we're from. That perhaps differentiates us, but the larger points are points of commonality. In the Quran, it says that we have created you male and female and have made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. The noblest of you in the sight of Allah, who is God, is the best in conduct. It's not that the noblest of you is the person who's from this part of the world, or who believes in this, or does this, or as far as has a certain background or profession, or all of those kind of things. The noblest, according to in the eyes of God, is the one who is the best in conduct, and that is what really differentiates people as far as how their intentions are, how they move forward in this world, how they are the best versions of themselves. And that is the most important thing from an Islamic perspective in the eyes of God. And then this idea of that people are of two types, either your brother or sister in faith, where you share the same faith, or you're equal in humanity. That ultimately, there's so much more that binds us than separates us, and that we're all really seeking for the same things in our lives, and towards the end of our life, we're seeking that hope, that meaning, and that connection to something greater than just ourselves. So thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry if I've gone over. I kind of do that sometimes, but it's really wonderful, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Sameer and Rabbi Mira and Reverend Andrea. That was an incredible series of presentations, and thank you so much for sharing open-heartedly and honestly with us today. I see that we have several questions coming in, so let's start with a few questions and to get the discussion going. So one question is, all three faith traditions are known to the public by the most orthodox or extreme manifestation of religious tradition. Can each of you speak to the range of observance that influences behavior at the end of life? So Rabbi Mira, let's start with you.
And could you phrase the question again? Yes, we do begin from the fundamentals. And the question is?
Can you speak to the range of observance that influences behavior at the end of life?
The in-betweens, right? All the in-betweens, those that are not spoken. And even how a person, say a Jewish person, might have begun their life, perhaps not being even part of the Jewish people, and how they veered in their lives towards maybe more observance, more community. So all of that really in many ways manifests and affect not the suffering, right? Not the experience of physical and chemical and and constitutional change, but really who is supporting them, right? So that the effect of the variance of observance is really manifest in who comes to support them during times of suffering, whether in an institution or at home.
Thank you. And Reverend Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, there is a lot of variation. I would say, I have had Catholic patients who maybe their partner is, say a Methodist. I'm Methodist, and particularly around an older generation, there was the fear, like, oh, my partner, my husband is not going to make it to heaven because he's not a Catholic. So there's sometimes great anguish around that. In fact, I had one couple, they'd been married for like 65 years, but the husband was Protestant, the woman was Catholic. He converted on his deathbed for her. I mean, he had peace that he was okay, but he wanted to alleviate her anxiety and fear that not being a Catholic, he, was gonna not be in heaven with her, when she died. So that was very painful to watch. Her anguish and then the tenderness that he converted, because it didn't, there wasn't any conflict with his faith. There are very liberal Protestant denominations that feel they would be embracing aid to dying, that don't have a problem with not putting in, extraordinary measures to keep someone alive. There's, I think, as Sameer was saying too, there's a sense that we are here, we live, we are born, we die, and then we move on. So, there is a huge range of perspectives around that. I've been with families at the end of life where the person dies, there's a rending of clothes, there's a shaking the deceased going, I'm going to kill you because you just died. And then there are very stoic people. Some of my Irish patients, they crack the window so that the spirit can go out of the room. So all of those cultural and theological beliefs impact a family's their understanding of suffering, how they handle it, and how they die and how their loved ones die. And as a professional, the role is really not to pass judgment on that, but to help support and ease and respect and gently offer reflection to help them get through their suffering. But in Christianity, there is a very real thing that if you've been a bad person, you're going to hell. I had one patient who confessed to me, he was not Catholic, but he confessed to me on his deathbed that he was like 90, that he had molested a young boy when he was in his 20s, and he had never told anyone. He was sobbing, thinking he was bound for hell because of that. So that to turn that over to a clergy person, I don't think he really believed that he was forgiven, but I had the opportunity to try to be that mouth of the divine and say, you are forgiven. So how we see our relationship with God and life, and it really does impact how we die. But there's a lot of extremes. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. We want to live as well as we can. We don't want to suffer a lot, and we hope that we do aspire to that next world when we die.
Thank you, Reverend Andrea. Sameer.
I would echo a lot of what has been said. I think that there's a diversity of opinions on how some of these things are approached. I mean, from an Islamic perspective, there are different sects, there are different viewpoints, and so it really does kind of um, vary depending on how the situation unfolds, what the situation is at the end of life, and how that is, and who is making the interpretation as well. So, for example, in some sects of Islam, each person is supposed to be well versed in the religion so they can actually interpret the law for themselves. So effectively, everyone is supposed to be a jurist and be able to interpret the law. But that requirement or responsibility is lifted from the general public if one such person emerges. In that instance, you can follow that person. So that responsibility is then lifted from me. I'm absolved of having to learn all the laws or understandings from a religious perspective. But if I wanted to do that, if I was that interested or that engaged with the material that I want to be a jurist and be able to understand, then I have to do a deep study into the religion from a religious um, perspective and get that knowledge and then be able to interpret interpret kind of the history, the laws, the traditions, the Quran, all of those things, and have my own way of approaching, for example, end of life issues. And that's completely legitimate and valid. So what ends up happening is most people don't become jurists or don't become so well versed, but there are a good number of people that are. And each individual is then find someone who is of that caliber, who they see as someone they can relate to, who they see as someone who might have a life view or perspective that they share with. And then you're permitted to follow that person on these kind of rulings. And again, this highlights this idea of this relationship between the individual and God, because today, someone is all of us are born differently as far as our natures. And if, let's say, you have somebody on the one end who is very much, so to speak, by the book, right? They believe that, okay, I need to do this stuff. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do my prayers on time. I'm going to do this on time. I'm going to do everything I'm supposed to do, right? But if someone does me wrong, right, then I can also retaliate to a certain, meaning like, an eye for an eye or something like that, right? Because something wrong has been done to me, and I can, not retaliate, but respond maybe in a very, maybe in a less forgiving way or something, right? I'm just throwing an example out there. I'm not saying, that this is permissible in Islam, but I'm saying that in any kind of situation, as far as a person's nature. Now, let's say you have somebody else who is someone who is very forgiving. And even when things are done to them, something they've been wronged or whatever, they just see the good and they're like, it's okay, it's fine. Like I'll kind of move on, show grace, compassion, all of those things and move on. And they may be a bit more lax in certain things, right? Some of the more religious ritual or things that are required of the religion. Now, those two individuals are very, very different in their natures, right? And so, and your faith, your religion, your perspective on religion and God is shaped by who you are, right? So it's very difficult to say that God will look at those two individuals in the same way, or the decisions they make in the same way, because they're built differently. He has created them differently. So although we have religion that kind of sets a baseline and has certain laws and traditions and all of that, there is this space in the middle where the individual and their God have a very distinct relationship. And some of these moments that we're talking about speak to that, right? It speaks to kind of a larger philosophy of an individual from the cradle to the grave that they have because of who they are, perhaps. So yeah, there's a wide variety of kind of approaches to these end of life discussions and how to approach it. Mike, I had, for example, I've had instances where in my own family, my grandparents, one of them was treated was treated very aggressively at the end of life because, my uncle said that do everything you can, um, and uh, and unfortunately when he passed away, he was connected to tubes and in a hospital in the middle of the night, and not in the way he perhaps would have wanted to. Whereas my grandmother, who subsequently passed away, my uncle said, no, do not do everything, right? Like, let her just go in peace. And so there are different, both are find resonance within the religion as far as being appropriate to do. One thing that is a discussion point is that once some type of end of life support has been started, then can it be stopped? And that's a very difficult question that is still being kind of robustly discussed. So thank you.
I could just hop in there too, Sameer, and just say I think that's where sometimes a clergy person, whether it's a rabbi, a minister, a priest, an imam, can really be helpful before those extreme measures are being done. Many times, if I was with a family who, say, was a Catholic family, and I was trying to walk them through that it might cause more harm to, their loved one if they added hydration or if they put in a feeding tube and then thinking about taking it out, they would hear me. But if I could pull the priest aside and say, I think they need a blessing from their tradition, that this is not a sin to not do extreme measures. It was so helpful. So I think that's where working as colleagues is so helpful. So the priest could go in and kind of give them permission that they were still good Catholics, even if they didn't choose to hydrate or to put a feeding tube in a parent. Same thing, pulling aside a rabbi colleague or an imam and being able to help a family speak with someone who represents their tradition, because I know as Christians, we're really not all jurists, and a lot of people, can't, find the Gospel of John or the Psalms in a Bible if they were given one. So they rely on clergy people that they trust to offer some perspective and to give them permission. We have families who do want to have everything done to them, and that's where advanced directives are helpful. My 88-year-old mother said, don't you dare hook me up to anything. I've had a great life. If something happens, you have to let me go. So that's helpful. And I said, well, you got to put that in writing, Mom. So, but yeah, so I think this is very important to have clergy people think about these things and talk, amongst with each other as well, how we can help.
And with a large soupçon of caution also. While we work in an interfaith way in hospitals and in adult rehabs, I have found, even as a Jewish person, navigating, for example, how I would serve an Orthodox family, right? I mean, I always give a lot of kavod, we say a lot of honor, to state to them, we are here to support you. Knowing that you might have your own supportive circle, we as clergy, even I as a liberal person who you might not even recognize, right? We are here to support you. Anything you need, we are here. And decisions that might be included in an ethical will or a halakhic will or an advanced care directive, right? Not even going close to those tipping points. We always defer to them and just err on the side of caution that way. And yeah, it is a delicate balance. It is a delicate dance, because oftentimes other colleagues from the large spectrum of faiths, on one hand, we know that there is a oneness, but also there is a kind of a cultural and religious sensitivity to everyone's preference. Delicate dance. And if I don't know, I ask my boss. I ask the person who is my supervisor.
Thank you. All three of you describe being a guide to someone through their end of life experience, um, and really from womb to tomb, you know, you're guiding at the very end of that journey, but it is a journey for which you guide them. And so one person, Donna Newmark in our audience, is wondering, Rabbi Rivera, would you mind speaking about withdrawing life support for a Jewish person? You know, that definitive decision, and what your thoughts are.
So we know we have a do not resuscitate, a DNR possibility. And in Jewish law, you protect the human life as much as you can and all the way. So those who hew to that expression of halakha or Jewish law will employ all of the, you know, like everything that a hospital has to keep life going. And then there are those also who find more resonance in the words of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life. And it would mean saving a life would be easing the trauma, you know, would be translated as easing the trauma on the body of the loved one, of the person. So in many ways, we navigate this by having, by writing, hopefully, a halachic will, an ethical, but I guess I would describe that as an ethical will that is, you know, guided by your community's beliefs and also by your understanding. And you do this with your rabbi, you do this with your teacher, with your community. And we encourage advanced care directives so that one's wishes are written down and seen. It varies.
Thank you. We have another question from Mark Peterson for all three of you. He's wondering if you can comment on medical aid in dying as it relates to your faith tradition.
Well, you know, I feel like, again, for Christians, which is, again, such a broad umbrella term, people are all over the map. And to me, it's related to how many Christians feel about abortion or a woman's right to choose in terms of terminating pregnancies. And so there's kind of a layer of fear and guilt. And then there's what people feel rationally and maybe politically. So there are many Christian traditions across the boards who would be very adamant about a woman's right to choose, while personally heartbroken over anyone who has to make that choice. So if you apply that to medical aid in dying, I think the unspoken thing for many Christians is they say, yeah, you know, that makes sense to me. You're not talking about someone who's just clinically depressed or a kid who's thinking about, you know, taking his or her own life. You're talking about someone at the end of their life trying to make a decision to have that completed life. I mean, to use this term, to say, I am right with, you know, my philosophy, my God, my faith, and I'm okay to be released from this suffering, this body. So I think many sort of middle of the road Christians, not the either extremes, they feel like that makes sense, but I think there's a fear of, does that mean that I'm for taking one's life, for murder, for however they want to frame it. So I think there's a lot of hand wringing and struggle over what makes sense in some ways, and a fear that that is committing a sin. I think anyone who's been with someone who's severely suffering at the end of their life will have a different perspective on what it is to compassionately accompany someone as their journey on this planet is coming to an end. And in those who do hope to be released from the body into an afterlife may be a little less hesitant to ask that someone suffer. And I want to hear what my colleagues say, but I will also say one of the problems for me as a clergy person is that I've also seen patients who are very comatose at the end of their life. They're not, you could say, well, they're not really living, but sometimes the healing that happens around the bedside among family members would not happen had that journey been cut short. So, I mean, it's something that I wrestle with myself, because I believe that the Spirit is present in all of those situations. So, you know, as Sameer said, I think it comes down to the individual and his or her relationship with God, and having trusted clergy that they can have those discussions with.
Thank you, Reverend. Sameer, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Reverend Andrea said. I think it really is a difficult area to navigate from a religious perspective, and I think that is where this kind of individualized relationship does come into play, because it's a very, very critical moment in a person's existence. And so it's very difficult sometimes for human beings who haven't gone through a situation to make determinations about something that they have yet to go through, right? It's almost like, you know, we talk about, from a legal perspective, having capacity to make decisions. And I wonder sometimes that, well, do we really have the capacity to make decisions when we don't know what we're deciding on, or how that, I mean, do we even have the capacity to make decisions in this moment about my end of life care? And not that we shouldn't have advanced directives, of course we should, and all of that, but that, you know, in that very, very personal space, which another person can't really understand, it's very, very difficult to navigate. And so I'm not trying to skirt the question. I'm just kind of trying to put a bit of a context to it, in addition to what the Reverend said. I would also say that intention plays a big role, like I mentioned earlier, that this idea of what are we trying to do, right? Is it that the suffering is so extreme, right? And it's just too much to bear, right? Or is it that, or is it for another reason? And so intention really does play a big role. And the example that I gave earlier about this, my father's aunt who, you know, was given this medication because of the extreme suffering she was enduring. And I think, what the Reverend mentioned about kind of having loved ones around as well at that moment, perhaps, give some comfort that otherwise would have been lost. So I think from an Islamic perspective, there are all these things, variables that need to be kind of assessed and determined on a case-by-case basis as well. What the rationale is, what the intention is. And in addition to that, there's this additional layer of complexity where there are clergy and jurists and others that are hotly debating this area as we learn more and as we find out more and as we see across the US and in other places, these things are becoming more and more legally permissible as well. So I think it's a space that we're still navigating in a lot of ways, and it's very complex as well.
Thank you. Rabbi Mira, any quick thoughts before we jump to the next question?
So it's very clear in Judaism that the ultimate owner, that life is in a way owned by the divine, owned by the universe. And so a Jew may not commit suicide. A Jew may not ask others to help in committing suicide, or even ask someone to help them terminate their own lives, because somehow this is seen as taking life. Taking one's life or deciding to end one's life is seen in that way. So withholding or withdrawing machines or medications from a terminally ill patient, however, does not constitute suicide and is permitted. So I'm sharing this with you from the point of view of my rabbis, my teachers. So this is the interesting twist here: withholding or withdrawing machines or medications from a terminally ill patient does not constitute the taking of one's life and therefore is permitted.
If I can just add, I mean, from an Islamic perspective, that is also true. That today, when there are these decisions that are being made, once a decision has been made to put someone, on kind of end of life support or anything like that, then it's very difficult to go back on that decision. But there is that moment where when that determination needs to be made, where people can say, no, I don't want anything to be done now anymore. But once some measure has been taken, then it's extremely difficult to walk back from that. And so, yes, thank you, Rabbi, for bringing that point up, because I think it's also a very important one in this discussion.
Thank you all. Our next question is from Rebecca Brown. She says that she really appreciated the Reverend's idea of shifting our hope for an outcome from curing to healing, especially in a spiritual, psychological, emotional way. And she's wondering, Reverend, can you please give some examples of how you may have been able to walk with someone into that new sense of peace with an outcome that includes perhaps further disability, enduring more suffering in a more debilitated state of being, and then death itself.
Sure. Yeah, I and thank you for the question, because I think it's one of the most important things that we do, not just as clergy, but as human beings, as we're with someone who has a terminal diagnosis. For example, I have really a dear friend, or had a dear friend who had cancer as a young woman, and then she went into remission. She had a mastectomy. She got married at like 39. She had her daughter on her 40th birthday. She nursed her baby with the one breast that she had. She was just a pillar. And then 16 years later, she's diagnosed with metastatic cancer again. So the devastation of that, her daughter was in high school. The devastation of that, as I was walking together with her really as a friend at that point, and obviously she knew I was clergy, but our hope initially was to, her hope was to have as long a life as she could. She just had this one child. She really wanted to see her graduate high school. That was like, she set little benchmarks. So I hope that I see her graduate high school, and I know then I'll hope to see her graduate college, and after that I hope to see her get married. So she had a lot of hope going along. And what I saw as my path then was just kind of walking with her, and when it was clear she wasn't even going to make that first benchmark, her hope was she was not going to see her daughter graduate high school, then our discussions became a different kind of thing. What do you hope for, Betty? I said, do we hope that your daughter will be surrounded by other loving mothers? And so we started to create a community of her friends who kind of pledged to her to be kind of maternal figures for her daughter. So her hope was that her daughter through her life would have support by these very loving mothers, which she has. Her hope was that she could be surrounded by this community in her dying, we gathered at her house for, days on end and sang and prayed and chatted and talked. And so her hope was to be surrounded by her friends. Her hope was that her husband would feel free to remarry. And we had those discussions with him that no, there's no guilt in that. She wants you to be happy. Her hope was that he would have a very happy, long life. So the hope was starting to transform when it was clear the hope was not going to be, it wasn't going to be cure, certainly with metastatic cancer. It wasn't even going to be a long life. And then her hope was that I would do her funeral service for her, and that and I would bring parts of her to that service and not just have a kind of a cookie cutter service. It's funny, the nursery school is letting out here. I don't know if you guys can hear that. But so her hope did transform to a very peaceful place where she was not going to get better. She was not going to have a long life, but she could hope for her daughter. She could hope for her husband, and she could hope that she would have a peaceful end to her life, which she did. She died at home. That was her hope. And then of course her hope was that she would maybe see them one day, in that next life. And that hope has yet to be fulfilled, but that was certainly there. So that's just one example of walking with someone from a hope to get better or to live longer. And then just each time, not dashing that hope and saying, listen, Betty, you have stage 4 metastatic cancer. It's not going to happen. That wasn't my job. Or you're going to get better. Don't worry. You're at Sloan Kettering. You're going to be fine. So you're not saying either of those things. You're just saying, well, let's pray that we can get through this. And she did. She was just a beautiful spirit. So I'm glad to share her story with you. She would like that.
Thank you. I really admire you for not promoting a false narrative of, it's going to get better, or, this is what you're destined to be, like this sense of real reality. Thank you. So the next question, what would each of you say in your tradition that could help contribute to someone who's not religious, not trying to convert them, but offering something essential that is non-theological, but still supportive to that person? What are your thoughts?
So very central to Jewish life, not even around death, but just living, right? And it's the idea of teshuvah, or return. So we have Yom Kippur as one of the markers of a year for us. Yom Kippur translates as a Day of Atonement, but the month before, really like a full month before the month, we have this opportunity for what we call like a spiritual accounting, right? The spiritual accounting of oneself, and we do this as a community, oftentimes in studies before Rosh Hashanah, before the New Year comes, and before Yom Kippur comes. So teshuvah, ways of repairing and returning, and like as we're rounding the circle, that circle that has been broken, is something that's encouraged like just all year long, right? And that is something like even at death or close to death or in illness, I would say, encourage a person, like, what are these ways that you would like to find some kind of a, not a completion, at least a movement of the spiral, right, in your relationships. So there's a sense of community and continuity rather than this is it. It's almost over. Because you never know. We don't know.
Thank you. Sameer.
Yeah, I think and this might sound a bit trite, and I don't mean it from a religious perspective either, but I think this idea of kind of looking upwards is important, right? And what I mean by that is, you know, sometimes when we are going through our daily kind of challenges, our struggles, or you know, obstacles, whatever it is, just taking a brief moment and literally just looking up, I think it puts certain things in perspective for us. I think it, one, makes us realize that there's so much more beyond us. I think it also makes us realize that there is something greater than us as well. And whether that's God, whether that's an energy, whether that's whatever we want to call that, there is something, kind of think, connecting to nature, I think connecting to something greater does invoke this belief in something beyond us. And I think that's really, really important, because I think in our most challenging times, whether we believe in God or not, or whether we believe God to be Allah or God, or you know, other reference point or name that we might use, that the fact that I think connecting to something that is vaster than us, greater than us, gives us a sense of comfort. And I think that is really, really important to do, because I think it helps us position ourselves in light of, you know, the vastness that exists beyond us. You know, I had read one thing that that said, do not tell your God, do not tell God how big your problems are, or do not tell God that you have great problems. Tell your problems that you have a great God, or something to that effect, right? And we can substitute God for anything that a person feels is a power that's greater than them in this world. So I think it's important to kind of put that in perspective a little bit, and at the same time, I would say that there's comfort in strength, right? That we are all going through this human condition, right? That we are all kind of going through whatever we go through, whether it's the grueling commute in the morning, or, you know, the excitement of seeing family or friends or children at the end of the day. That this is all part of our existence in this world. And just, I think, sometimes realizing that we're not alone, even though we may be alone in that moment of our own problems, but that we're all going through things together, and trusting that process in light of the vastness beyond us, I think, is something that helps.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in just briefly and say, you know, I've walked with many people who were not religious, who were atheists, who were agnostic. And what I found with some of my patients who didn't have who didn't feel like there was something greater than themselves, but the comfort and the joy often came from life review, from still trying to find meaning, what gives their life's meaning. And it might have been, you know, the love in their family. It might have been a very rewarding career, or, you know, they love their dog. That's what they, you know, they did. And so life review is sometimes very comforting. And sometimes even in a big family, you know, like, I've heard mom tell that story 100 times. Well, she needs to tell it. So so I loved hearing people's stories. I was kind of new ears for people. So people who are not religious, to feel like affirmed in their life, to let them review their life. What was meaningful? What did they feel good about? What were they, did they have regrets? Can they let them go? Are there amends they need to make with certain people? Those are all things that are very comforting to people who are not necessarily religious. And then often talking about what kind of moral legacy would they like to leave? As they're dying, is there some way that they want to do that process that's going to be comforting to their family in the long run? So to find some dignity in the choices that they're making, and knowing that really the only thing we know about eternal life for certain is in the stories that are told about us. And so what stories would they like their family to tell? How do they want to live on in the world when they don't necessarily believe there's another world out there? So people who are not religious can still find great joy and concrete meaning in kind of reviewing their days. And that's just a wonderful process to be a part of.
And one thing I'd like to share also, just to echo Reverend Andrea here, is, you know, these one-on-one encounters, while as chaplains we are positive, meaning bright and present, right, at the moment. At least speaking for myself, I will not promise that I will see you in 2 weeks. The moment itself is full and I have to say goodbye. And that was like one of the hardest lessons I had to learn, right? Especially amongst the terminally ill. Not to say, I'm going to see you, I promise you. No, there are no promises. But there's a goodbye, a really gentle and loving goodbye.
I did have one patient, by the way, who was my favorite kind of patient. It was an old crusty guy who had been raised of faith, but he wasn't religious anymore. And I always offered, you know, listen, Joe, do you want me to say a prayer before I go? And he always said no, but I figured I'd offer it anyway. And at the very end of his life, I said, you know, Joe, do you want me to, you know what I'm going to offer? And he's like, oh, if it'll make you feel better, just go ahead. And I think it actually made him feel a little bit better too. But what it did is he was affirming my faith and my kind of compassion for him. And I was hearing in that he was a little afraid as well. So you never know.
Thank you. I have just one more question before we end for today. This is from Judith. She's wondering, have patients ever said that they want assisted or self-delivered death in order to spare loved ones the agony of seeing them in a prolonged death, to spare them the psychological and emotional burden and to help them move on? And separately, a question from Peggy in the chat as well, saying that all U.S. medical aid in dying statutes assert that this does not constitute suicide or assisted suicide or euthanasia, and whether that makes a difference in how you understand aid in dying. So one part of the question is, have patients ever asked for assistance? And the second part of the question is, does the U.S. medical aid in dying statute position change your position on the request?
I've never been asked. Nobody asked me directly. But also, has it changed? Has the statute changed my attitude? I think more than anything, I really encourage people to write an advanced care directive, right? Or from the very get-go, if they have not entered the hospital without that, or even when someone's health is failing, or even when not, right? That even when not, just to contemplate the idea of having an ethical will to actually think about these things. So I believe more in the preemptive, but no, I had not been asked.
Thank you. Sameer?
Yeah, so I haven't been asked either, but there have been instances that I've heard of, you know, I think there's one in particular where it was just a very, very difficult situation, but I wasn't involved in it. But yes, it is something that I've heard of, I can't speak to the specific circumstances around the situation that I did hear of, but I've not been involved in that kind of situation myself. As far as the statute, I think what it does is, I think that explicit acknowledgement opens it up for discussion in religious circles. And I think that is something where all of the things that we've been talking about would emerge, as far as the rationale, the intention, what is the purpose, what is the pros, the cons. I mean, these things which are difficult again to articulate sometimes, but I think by that kind of a statement, it requires people of all faith traditions to open a dialogue about it. Because if it's explicitly saying this is not suicide, which is prohibited, for example, in Islam, meaning suicide is prohibited in Islam, then that compels a conversation about, well, what is this and how do you navigate it? So I think that is, it's a positive in the respect that it opens up a conversation.
Thank you. And Reverend Andrea.
Just briefly, probably the only person who asked me directly is the dancer of whom I spoke earlier, who asked me specifically 20 years ago to help her end her life, and I wasn't, kind of willing or able to do that at the time. I have had family members, a patient who's dying, say, I don't want to cause my family any more suffering. I wish I could just let go and die. But no one has ever asked me to administer a cocktail or access medication that would help them do that. So when someone says that to me, it always prompts a discussion around their suffering, and then a family discussion, around, and it gives the family member a chance to say, we don't see you as a burden, but we also don't want you to suffer. In those conversations, there can be some very healing discussion for the patient to express his or her tremendous suffering and the heartache of knowing that, like it or not, they do feel like a burden on their family members. And I have had patients say, if I stop eating and drinking, how long do you think that I'll live? How long will that go on? And I do know patients who, towards the very end of their life, made a pretty conscious effort to not eat or drink anything. So the discussion was more around, if as of tomorrow I stop eating and drinking, how long do you think it'll take me to die? And I could have that kind of a conversation with them and respect that was part of their end of life journey. But yeah, I haven't had anyone specifically, and I agree with you in terms of the laws right now. It opens up the conversation. It eases a little burden, even though people will still feel their spiritual or religious questions. It eases a little bit of the burden of the ethical burden, I guess I should say.
Well, thank you all so much for an incredible presentation and discussion, and thank you to our live audience for your wonderful questions. I want to thank Sameer Ladha, Rabbi Mira Rivera, and Reverend Andrea Raynor for your time today and for joining us and being present. We are deeply grateful for your attendance today, so thank you so much. Really an incredible discussion from Reverend Andrea's point of helping shift hope for the patient from the hope of getting better to the hope for reconciliation, to Rabbi Mira's, the importance of human presence and touch at the very end of life, and to Sameer's, the intention of good intent is perhaps more important at the very end, and many other really great points. So thank you all so much. This concludes our third session and final session for the March Symposium for the Completed Life Initiative. We've been so grateful to have all of you along with us for this day-and-a-half journey. And please stay tuned for more events coming soon in April and beyond from the Completed Life Initiative. I just want to offer a brief correction to Rabbi Mira's title. She is a board certified chaplain in good standing with the Neshama Association of Jewish Chaplains that we didn't include earlier. So apologies for that, but wanted to mention that briefly. And please visit our website, www.completedlife.org, for further updates, and stay tuned on our mailing list for upcoming events. So be well, thank you again, and have a wonderful weekend.